Reading from the April 9th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: traders sent crude futures to one of their largest one-day drops on record, while the Dow rose 2.8%, logging its best day since April 9th, 2025. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ rose 2.5% and 2.8% respectively. Most officials at the Fed's policy meeting last month thought progress in taming inflation could be slower than expected, driven by three concerns, minutes show. Jeff Shell resigned as Paramount's president and is stepping down as a board member, the media and entertainment company said. Meta Platforms announced a new closed large language AI model called Muse Spark and plans to release a private preview to a few partners via an API. Delta reported its first quarterly loss in nearly 3 years after the airline's fuel expense rose by $330 million and the values of companies in which it has a stake fell. Cornerstone Building Brands hired consulting firm Alex Partners to negotiate with creditors to restructure its nearly $5 million balance sheet. C.K. Hutchinson began arbitration proceedings against Maersk after Panama seized its port assets there, escalating a dispute that began in January. European companies that list at home outperform peers that choose the U.S., according to a report that challenges a common inverse assumption. ByteDance's TikTok is investing the equivalent of $1.16 billion to build a second data center in Finland. Now for the key articles under the worldwide section. A 2-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran teetered as Israel launched massive attacks on Lebanon and Iran threatened to reverse its plan to open the Strait of Hormuz to traffic. The damage to key Middle Eastern energy hubs will ensure a prolonged squeeze on global oil and gas markets, even if the strait reopens. The Trump administration is considering a plan to punish some NATO members that the president believes were unhelpful to the U.S. and Israel during the war. Josephine Senga, the drug dealer behind the fatal ketamine trade that killed TV star Matthew Perry, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. People with a common gene variant lost more weight on GLP-1 weight loss drugs than those without it, researchers reported. Turkey detained 9 people as part of an investigation into an attack on police outside a building housing the Israeli consulate in Istanbul. Greece plans to ban social media for children under the age of 15, joining other countries considering or enforcing restrictions to shield younger users from harmful content. An attorney for a man shot by Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents during an arrest in Central California rejected the agency's allegations about his client. Died Davy Lopez, 80, Los Angeles Dodgers All-Star. Jim Whittaker, 97, first American to reach the summit of Mount Everest. The picture on today's front page takes place in a very populated city with many buildings, and smoke is arising from one of the huge, what appears to be apartment or office building. And that caption reads, "Smoke rises from an Israeli airstrike on the suburbs of Beirut as the U.S. and Iran disputed what was required in the ceasefire." And that headline reads, "Ceasefire teeters on its first day. Iran threatens to keep Strait closed in response to Israeli strikes on Lebanon." By Salah al-Batati, Feliz Solomon, and Omar Abdel Bakwi. A 2-week ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran was on tender hooks Wednesday, as Israel launched massive attacks on Lebanon and Iran threatened to reverse its plan to open the Strait of Hormuz to traffic. Both the U.S. and Iran claimed victory on Wednesday, after both countries agreed to a ceasefire to end the war that began in late February. But Iran continued to fire missiles and drones at Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, and Israel unleashed a barrage of deadly strikes against Hezbollah militants in Lebanon. Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, accused the U.S. on X of several key violations of his country's 10-point framework to end the war. These breaches, he wrote, make both the ceasefire and negotiations for a longer peace agreement effectively meaningless. From the outset, we followed the ongoing process with distrust, and as expected, the United States once again violated its commitments even before negotiations began, he wrote on Wednesday. President Trump said on Tuesday that the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week pause in fighting, conditional on the immediate reopening of the strait, while pointing to progress on a 10-point proposal from Tehran. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said reports on Wednesday that Iran had closed the strait in response to Israel's strikes in Lebanon were false. A closed strait is completely unacceptable to Trump, Leavitt said. 4 ships were allowed to pass on Wednesday, the fewest so far in April, according to S&P Global Market Intelligence, down from more than 100 a day before the war. Iran is requiring ships to work out toll arrangements ahead of time and then pay the fees in cryptocurrencies or yuan, mediators and ship brokers said. Leavitt said it wasn't a definitively accepted policy position that Iran would be allowed to charge tolls on ships moving through the strait. Israel, which wasn't formally part of the Iran negotiations, expressed unhappiness after learning that a deal was completed without its consultation. It said it had halted attacks on Iran but was continuing military operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah, prompting protest from Iran. The White House said on Wednesday that Israel's conflict with Hezbollah militants in Lebanon wasn't part of the ceasefire deal. The extent of the consultation was Trump calling Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel shortly before the ceasefire was announced, a White House official said. Netanyahu agreed to participate in the ceasefire, the official said. Mediators said Israeli officials weren't happy with the terms, including the planned inclusion of Lebanon in the agreement, as Israel considers Iran and Lebanon separate arenas. Netanyahu said Wednesday morning that the deal didn't include Lebanon, contradicting an earlier statement by Pakistan, which is mediating the talks. Vice President J.D. Vance is scheduled to lead a team of negotiators in weekend talks in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, the White House said. He is to be joined by Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Levitt said on Wednesday. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said the ceasefire with the U.S. must include a pause in Israel's conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Iran-U.S. ceasefire terms are clear and explicit. The U.S. must choose ceasefire or continued war via Israel. It cannot have both, Araghchi wrote on X. The world sees the massacres in Lebanon. The ball is in the U.S. court, and the world is watching whether it will act on its commitments. The Israeli airstrikes killed dozens of people and injured hundreds more, Lebanon's health ministry said, adding that rescue efforts were underway to find others still trapped under rubble. The ministry didn't say how many were civilians or combatants. Israel's military said it carried out strikes on more than 100 targets within a span of minutes against the Iran-backed militant group. Some of the strikes targeted Hezbollah hideouts in densely populated areas in the capital, Beirut. Israel said militants are moving from their traditional stronghold in the city's southern suburbs toward civilian areas farther north for refuge. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Gulf states worry 2-week truce left Iran emboldened and powered. Allies say war gains are overshadowed by Iran's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. By Yaroslav Trofimov, Dubai. The Iranian government hailed the ceasefire with the U.S. by posting images on social media of President Trump waving the white flag and collapsing on his knees in defeat. The U.S. allies and partners in the Middle East fear Tehran might have a point, and that they will end up paying the price for a war in which the overwhelming military might of the U.S. and Israel failed to secure political gains. Subjected to thousands of Iranian missiles and drone strikes since the war's start, the Gulf states are grappling with how to survive next to an emboldened Iran that, as of now, retains control over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is the only one that is happy with the outcome. They have now been reestablished as the policemen of the Gulf, said Mohammed Bararoum, Director General of the Bahouth Dubai Public Policy Research Center, a think tank in the United Arab Emirates. We woke up to a deal that doesn't reduce the risk, but instead replaces it with a bigger risk. To be sure, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has sustained heavy losses, including much of its leadership. And the 2-week ceasefire doesn't mean an end to fighting. Officials in the Middle East believe there is a significant chance the war will flare up again, possibly with greater intensity. The region's future is slated for discussion by the U.S. and Iran at talks Friday in Islamabad, Pakistan. It's important to keep things in perspective. This is a temporary 2-week ceasefire. This is not a deal, said Hamad Al-Tunayan, a political analyst and professor at Kuwait University. We could see an extension of that deadline, but we could also see a return to hostilities. The speed with which Trump went from threatening Tuesday morning that a whole civilization will die tonight to accepting Iran's maximalist 10-point demands as a basis for negotiations has left many in the Gulf questioning how hard Washington will push for a deal that achieves its objectives and protects the U.S.'s friends. Trump has decided to compromise, and with that compromise, he has sidestepped his allies in the Gulf, said Mahdi Ghulam, a Bahrainian researcher at the ORF Middle East think tank. Few in the Gulf approved of Trump's pledge to destroy Iran's energy infrastructure and bomb the country until it reopened the Strait of Hormuz. On Wednesday, there was a sense of relief in Dubai, Doha, and Kuwait that these Gulf cities avoided potentially catastrophic Iranian retaliatory strikes on their power plants and water desalination facilities. Still, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates reported sporadic Iranian missile and drone attacks continuing Wednesday, raising doubts about whether the ceasefire would hold. Separately, fighting continued in Lebanon, where Israel said it is going to pursue its campaign against the Iranian-backed Hezbollah militia. Gaps remain between the Iranian and U.S. positions, including on the issue of Hormuz, a lifeline for the Gulf where 1/5 of the world's oil and gas once passed. While Trump said Iran agreed to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz, a statement by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi insisted that passage through the international waterway will remain permissible only in coordination with Iran's military. Iran has been collecting tolls from the vessels passing the strait since the war began, a practice it seeks to make permanent to pay for its reconstruction. The real verdict comes Friday in Islamabad. If Iran walks away retaining any form of control over the Strait of Hormuz, it is an Iranian victory, full stop, said Nadim Kodiak, an Emirati analyst and political advisor. If the world succeeds in stripping Iran from weaponizing Hormuz the way it was stripped from weaponizing uranium, then this war, whatever its cost, is a strategic defeat for the Islamic Republic. Iran's plan calls for permanent Iranian control over Hormuz, acceptance of Iranian uranium enrichment, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the Middle East, the lifting of sanctions, and the payment of compensation to Iran. It doesn't mention any limitations on Iran's missile and drone arsenal or any curbs on its cooperation with militant groups like Hezbollah or Yemen's Houthis. Peace deal sends stocks up, drives oil into a sharp drop. By David Uberti, Hannah Aaron Lang, and Jared Mitovich. A historic plunge in oil prices, a soaring stock market, a treasury rally. They all arrived Wednesday despite missiles and drones continuing to fly across the Middle East. For weeks, pressure has built on Wall Street for a post-war rally that no one wanted to miss. Stock pickers hung on President Trump's every word for signs of de-escalation. Shorts on crude futures and energy stocks piled up. The U.S. and Israeli ceasefire with Iran on Wednesday kicked many of those trades into high gear, even as the outlook for skyscraper-sized tankers of oil and gas transiting one of the world's energy choke points remains unclear. As traders sent crude futures to one of their largest one-day drops on record, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 2.8%, or around 1,325 points, logging its best day since April 9th, 2025. There was a kind of pent-up demand for a modicum of good news, said Phil Blancato, chief market strategist at Osaic. Investors on Wednesday didn't wait for signs of whether the ceasefire will hold or if ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz picks up. Benchmark U.S. oil prices plunged 16%, a decline not seen since the depths of the pandemic, to $94.41. The Sea and Neighbors Are Angry on Nantucket by Chris Maher and Gretchen Tarrant Gulla. Syosconset, Massachusetts. A vandal is at large on Nantucket, an island better known for gray-shingled cottages, boat shoes, and billionaires. In January, someone apparently slashed a 947-foot-long structure of sand-filled tubes designed to slow erosion of scenic Sconset Bluff. The damage to the project, on which homeowners spent about $18 million and could cost another $2 million to repair, has inflamed a battle between people trying to save expensive summer homes teetering on the bluff's edge, and year-rounders who have said nature should take its course. It's shocking, said Josh Posner, president of the Sconset Beach Preservation Fund. The group is trying to protect 80 houses on Baxter Road, an enclave with spectacular ocean views and named properties such as Owl's Nest. Members of the Hirsch and Soros families own homes there, along with legendary commodities trader Helmut Weimar and Amos Hofstetter, a Boston-based billionaire and philanthropist. Erosion fights are raging on coastlines nationwide as sea levels rise and intense storms devour beaches and prime real estate. Few have been as entrenched as Nantucket's. The dispute involves lawsuits, testy town meetings, and talk of class conflicts. Lifelong friends now find themselves on opposing sides, with one faction even accusing the other side of engineering a political purge of the island's Conservation Commission. And now, ahead of a May town meeting that could decide whether the homeowners can expand the geotubes project to protect more homes, someone or something has struck. The Nantucket Police Department, which launched a probe, is considering all possibilities, including Mother Nature. The Baxter Road Group hired former Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis to investigate cuts to the sturdy plastic tubes. His verdict: this was in no way an accident or the result of natural forces. The homeowners are offering a $10,000 reward to flush out the culprit. Now leaving the front page, Hutchinson begins Marsk arbitration over ports by Megan Chia. Hong Kong conglomerate C.K. Hutchinson has started arbitration against A.P. Muller-Marsk after Panama seized its port assets in the country. The move escalates a dispute that began in January when a Panamanian court voided C.K. Hutchinson's contracts to run 2 terminals at either end of the Panama Canal. The company, founded by Hong Kong billionaire Lee Hasling, has also filed claims against the Panamanian government. Hutchison Unit Panama Ports Company said Tuesday it had filed the arbitration against Marsk, accusing it of undermining a long-term contract. The arbitration is separate from Hutchinson's case against Panama and will be heard in London. The unit said Marsk was aligned with the Republic of Panama against it and a plan to replace it through a takeover that installed new port operators. Marsk does not believe it is liable for the claims and will address them in the appropriate forum. We have no further comment at this time, the shipper said. Hutchison has been in dispute over the concessions since Panama's Supreme Court ruled its port operations unconstitutional. Set against rising China-U.S. tensions, the ruling was seen as a win for the Trump administration's efforts to curb China's influence in the Western Hemisphere. China's Office of Hong Kong Affairs said that the Supreme Court ruling was unfounded, unreasonable, and absurd, noting that Hutchinson's contract had been in force for nearly 30 years. In a recent earnings report, Hutchinson said the issue has complicated talks over a potential sale of stakes in certain port assets. The company had planned to sell the 2 contested ports as part of a $23 billion deal to a group that includes BlackRock. Analysts said the financial impact was limited, noting the ports contributed little to earnings. Shares closed 3.9% higher in Hong Kong on Wednesday, taking year-to-date gains to around 19%. Trump aims to punish some nations. by Annie Linsky and Robbie Gramer, Washington. The Trump administration is considering a plan to punish some members of the NATO alliance the president believes were unhelpful to the U.S. and Israel during the Iran war, according to administration officials. The proposal would involve moving U.S. troops out of North Atlantic Treaty Organization member countries deemed unhelpful and stationing them in countries that were more supportive. The proposal would fall far short of President Trump's recent threats to fully withdraw the U.S. from the alliance, which he can't do without Congress. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Trump declares premature victory. Iran is still a threat to the Strait and may retain enriched uranium. Did the war with Iran that began with a roar end with a whimper? That's the way it looks in the cold light of Wednesday, after President Trump's announcement late Tuesday night of a 2-week ceasefire. Mr. Trump achieved some of his war aims, but the Iranian regime remains a threat in the Strait of Hormuz, and the job is far from finished, despite what he promised last week. Mr. Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance said the ceasefire is conditioned on Iran striking a deal, but it sure sounds like the president wants the war over. A big day for world peace. Iran wants it to happen. They've had enough. Likewise, so has everyone else, he posted on Truth Social early Wednesday. Will Mr. Trump really start bombing again if Iran draws out talks? Given the risks to oil prices, count us skeptical. This president can change his mind in a minute, but this sounds like the end of this round of hostilities. So what is the result? The U.S. and Israel succeeded in further degrading Iran's nuclear program beyond what they did in June. The main nuclear sites were bombed again, though not hitting the underground site of Pickaxe Mountain was a mistake. The regime now knows the U.S. will monitor any new nuclear activity and can always strike again. This is a better check on its chances of getting a bomb than another piece of diplomatic paper. The nearly 40 days of bombing also did enormous damage to Iran's military and its industrial base. Its navy is destroyed, its air defenses gone, and its drone and missile stockpiles and production substantially degraded. This will take years to rebuild, even with the likely help of Russia and China. All of this was accomplished with minimal American losses. The demonstration effect of the U.S. military's combined arms operation against Russian and Chinese air defenses won't be lost on the world. The biggest disappointments are Iran's continuing threat to the Strait of Hormuz and what happens to its enriched uranium stockpile. Mr. Trump is sending confusing signals about both that Iran is contradicting. On the uranium, Mr. Trump says Iran will turn its stocks over as part of a deal. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said Iran will either turn it over or the U.S. will go get it. But the latter would require ground troops and potential casualties. The better time to do that would have been before a ceasefire. If Iran retains its uranium stocks, U.S. and Israeli monitoring will have to be extensive. As for the strait, will Iran now be able to treat it like a toll road? This isn't clear, but signs aren't good. Mr. Trump said Wednesday the U.S. and Iran might have a joint venture toll operation in the strait, which is a bad idea, even if Iran accepted it. Before the war, the strait was a free-flowing international waterway, even if Iran could always have shut it down. On Wednesday, Iran was limiting ship traffic and charging a toll. Freedom of navigation has been a bedrock U.S. principle for centuries. China would be pleased if that principle were abandoned in case it has designs on the Straits of Taiwan or Malacca. If Iran retains a veto over traffic in the strait, that would count as a U.S. defeat. It would also mean a new risk premium is likely to be built into the global price of oil, despite the sharp plunge in the price on news of the ceasefire. Before the war, the global price was close to $65 a barrel. Will the new floor be $80, at least for some time? Which brings us back to the 2-week ceasefire and U.S.-Iran talks. Mr. Trump said Wednesday that Iran wants a deal, but Iran's 10-point plan for negotiations is miles away from Mr. Trump's demands. Iran wants the U.S. to withdraw from the Middle East, no more attacks by Israel on Hezbollah, and the lifting of all sanctions on Iran, among other things. The version released in Farsi includes the acceptance of uranium enrichment, which Mr. Trump has rightly said isn't acceptable. If the regime behaves as it always has, it will claim to want to reach a deal, but never will. The talks will stretch through 2 weeks, then 3, then months. Iran will bet that Mr. Trump won't resume bombing as the midterm elections approach. The rest of the world and Republicans in Congress will lean on Mr. Trump not to resume the fight. The unfortunate truth is that Mr. Trump put himself in this position. His inconsistent rhetoric on the war, claims of victory amid threats of unleashing hell and an end to Iran's civilization, raised global fears and undermined support at home and abroad. The next test for Mr. Trump will be whether he takes his 2-week ceasefire deadline seriously. If he does, and Iran plays its usual games, then he really will have to finish the job. From the opinion pages, the U.S.-Iran war isn't over. Washington advanced its aims more than Tehran did, and a ceasefire isn't a permanent settlement. By Holman W. Jenkins, Jr. The press is immediately executing on its template for the Iran ceasefire, claiming Donald Trump bailed on his war aims so Iran would let him off the hook on the Hormuz Strait. Example, an Iranian victory. In fact, I expected the outcome since about day 7, including China's role in bringing about a settlement, though minus any blather on my part about a victory for the mullahs. What the Standard take overlooks is that tomorrow is another day. The many arms and long reach of the U.S. government will turn to its long-term goals in Iran, which are the same for Mr. Trump as for those presidents who preceded him. Indeed, a conspicuous driver for Mr. Trump was to be seen putting a stake in a problem that has bedeviled presidents since Jimmy Carter. He came up short of his best hopes, unsurprisingly. But the night is young, and military deployments aren't sporting events. The first Gulf War arguably had two winners: Saddam Hussein for surviving, the U.S. for kicking him out of Kuwait. Wisely, Mr. Trump didn't let Iran spin him into a large-scale military operation to reopen the strait. Apart from steady dismantlement of the assets Iran was using to threaten shipping, reopening the strait became Mr. Trump's peace aim, not his war aim. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, we're told by Time magazine, argued before the war that the U.S. could safely raise the strikes. Iran, as on past occasions, would temporize rather than escalate. This miscalculation Mr. Trump would later paper over with his Who Knew Act, claiming nobody expected Iran to block Gulf shipping and attack its neighbors. But the risks were known. They had long been advertised by Iran's leaders. In any existential war, they said they would expand the battlefield by targeting the world's oil supply, while also kicking command authority down to dispersed units to survive decapitation. Iran's so-called mosaic defense. Iran having played this hand, the press now claims Iran owns the Hormuz Strait. This gets things backward. Iran's leaders have maintained as much for decades, frequently attacking or harassing shipping to prove their point. The same threat, by the way, belonged to any country in the region that could point its artillery or missiles at the floating bombs known as oil and LNG tankers. Now the Trump administration and the Israelis have destroyed a long list of Iranian military assets that will take years and billions to replace. During those years, other things will happen. I doubt these will include a reflowering of the Iranian economy, new domestic popularity for the regime, or neighbors letting bygones be bygones. If the mullahs survive, they will be more taxed than ever to fend off opposition both internal and external. To say Iran is sitting pretty would be a misreading. In the meantime, what have we learned? No U.S. president is going to sacrifice vital American interest to international law. That's my answer to those who engage in pointless debates about whether U.S. actions were illegal. Mr. Trump's madman theory works at the margin, with China recognizing that U.S. prestige was invested. Yet Mr. Trump's over-the-top rhetoric about Iran's civilizational erasure came the same day he engaged in relaxed and jokey conversation with the Artemis astronauts. Call it signaling. The Gulf states, we're told, have been disabused of trusting the U.S., which has its own interests. In 1997, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright spoke of the desirability of the Gulf states doing more for their own security. Stability is not an import, it must be homegrown. Hardly had George W. Bush's troops reached Baghdad when he was packing up the U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia. A key aim had been to let the U.S. disinvest from the Middle East. Mr. Trump spent his first term signaling that Gulf allies should play a bigger role in their own defense, including in cooperation with Israel. Lesson to be underlined. Just because the U.S. Navy can force the strait open doesn't mean it needs to. China is a factor to noodle over. With an important summit looming, it seems possible Mr. Trump's timing was partly to show off to Beijing the extent of U.S. destructive power and his willingness to use it. A final lesson is perhaps redundant. Substack and X, if you know where to look, are better sources for living brain analysis of current events than much of the traditional press, where opinionating is performative and commercially formulaic. The reflective need to strike pro and anti-Trump notes blots out everything that might be interesting to a curious and thinking reader. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. What Victory Looks Like in Iran by Jonathan Panikoff. President Trump's decision to accept a 2-week ceasefire with Iran brought down oil prices. But unless the war concludes with freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz and a resolution of Iran's nuclear program, this tactical victory will be a strategic loss. If Mr. Trump declares success and walks away, he will accelerate the outcomes he went to war to prevent, further isolate U.S. allies, and leave Iran with advantages it lacked when the conflict began. Mr. Trump has 3 options to bring the war to a final conclusion. He could resume military operations and send U.S. ground troops to Karg Island or other strategic locations to increase U.S. pressure against Iran. If he did this, however, Tehran would be unlikely to capitulate. He could use the next 2 weeks to negotiate an end to the war with terms that address Iran's ballistic missile and nuclear programs, including its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, as well as its support to terrorist proxies and freedom of navigation. But the U.S. and Iran likely aren't aligned on acceptable minimum requirements, especially as Tehran thinks it is winning. Issues like the nuclear program could be kicked down the road. The third option is that Mr. Trump could threaten to strike Iran again if it rebuilds its nuclear program or impedes global trade, but declare unilateral victory and an end to the U.S. combat mission without resolving the core outstanding issues. On the surface, there's a logic to this third option. Thanks to U.S. and Israeli operational success, Iran's ability to project threats in the region is diminished, even as its remaining drone inventory and ballistic missiles remain a threat. With Iran's newfound deterrence lever, control over passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Mr. Trump also will be under pressure from European and East Asian allies who will be loath for the war to restart and face further energy and commodity shortages. If the president takes this path, he will have diminished the immediate threat to Israel and the Gulf states, but he also will have ceded de facto control of the strait to Iran, put Tehran in a more advantageous position, and demonstrated to other rogue nations the value of controlling global shipping choke points. Tehran's ability to generate revenue that flows directly from the pockets of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and toward construction of its ballistic missile and terrorist capabilities will be solidified. Worse still, the pace of revenue generation would accelerate. These capabilities will certainly put Gulf allies and Israel at risk again. If Iran remains strong and well-funded, Israel will likely need to mow the grass frequently to prevent Iran from becoming a serious threat again, striking Iranian military targets as they are being developed. This would mean more conflict for Israel and for the Gulf Arab states, which have endured attacks from Iran in recent weeks. A perpetual mow the grass strategy also risks recurrent global economic disruptions. Many countries' commercial, trade, energy, and economic futures are tied up in the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran's willingness, even eagerness, to hold the strait hostage demonstrates its discovery of new leverage that it didn't dare previously test. The war will have increased Iranian regional influence and decreased global freedom of navigation. Most Gulf states, along with European and East Asian allies, would be horrified at such a result. Russia and China would benefit, gaining diplomatic influence. In the war's aftermath, Iran would initially be even more economically dependent on China, needing revenue from oil, for which Beijing is the only customer able to take large quantities. Russia would almost certainly offer new opportunities for security cooperation. The regime's staying power is a lesson adversaries have had to relearn. Its fight for survival means it is unlikely to topple quickly, regardless of internal pressure or external strikes. Many hope the conflict would lead to rapid regime collapse, but the regime's dogged efforts to stay in power prove that was never realistic. While Iran's domestic, economic, and ecological challenges may eventually generate the internal fissures to drive regime change, history has proved that guns trump words. For the regime to fall, the Iranian people will need someone with arms to switch sides or stand aside. Iran's transition from a theocratic autocracy to a more militaristic one is already underway. The supreme leader will continue to be important, but is unlikely to be the sole decision maker for the regime. New IRGC leaders won't waver in their commitment to the ideological underpinnings of the 1979 revolution. They are likely to be angrier and more hardline. Iran will almost certainly seek to rebuild its ballistic missile capacity. Its drones have proved themselves to be a low-cost, high-impact resource that isn't going away. Clearly, Mr. Trump's third option is a dangerous one. That brings us back to the first and second options. Putting troops on the ground would be anathema to Mr. Trump and the American people. While the dangers of inserting troops into Iranian territory shouldn't be underestimated, the more complex challenge would be holding the territory. It would tie up U.S. forces and resources for months or years, not days or weeks, and the scope of the war would broaden. And once forces flow in, history shows additional forces are often needed to support them. Mr. Trump's decision to accept the ceasefire suggests that he was looking for an off-ramp, and therefore U.S. troops on the ground aren't his preferred next step. That means that the negotiation of the next 2 weeks will be the most consequential in which the Trump administration has ever engaged. The president needs to include in the negotiations experts on the nuclear file, Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, sanctions, maritime trade, energy, and terrorism. Although he may be loath to do so, he would be wise to consult European, Gulf, and East Asian allies as part of the negotiations. For there to be a U.S. victory, the deal reached must encompass a resolution to Iran's nuclear program and the remaining highly enriched uranium. It must also ensure freedom of navigation without an Iranian toll on the Strait of Hormuz. If this outcome comes to fruition, then the U.S. will have gotten more than could have been achieved with diplomacy alone, because the war addressed, for the medium term, Iran's ballistic missile capability, over which the regime was never previously willing to negotiate. If negotiations end with Iran still in control of the strait or of the highly enriched uranium stocks, then the war will have been a series of magnificent operational successes, but a strategic failure. The nuclear threat will remain, and a new global economic danger will have been created. Comparing the mortgage rates from last week to this week, a 30-year fixed mortgage was 6.56%, now 6.49%. A 15-year mortgage was 5.95%, now 5.89%. Jumbo mortgages were 6.57%, now 6.49%. 5-year adjustable mortgage was 6.01%, now 5.95%. A new car loan was 6.86%, now 6.93%. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 9th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal, which we read every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful weekend.